In my lecture today, I'll talk about international courts and how particular international courts have become a fundamental part of global governance. If we look back just a few decades, there were roughly a handful of international courts, but today they're multiplying and we have around 25 operative international courts. So there's a proliferation of international courts, but what's also interesting is that international courts are generally becoming more prolific. That is, there are more decisions, more judgments coming out of international courts. And we estimate that roughly 90% of all court decisions from international courts have been delivered over the past 2.5 decades. And that is 90% of a total amount of roughly 45,000 international legal decisions. So there are more of them, they're proliferating, they're becoming more prolific, but they're also in a way changing qualitatively. Historically, when you established the first international court, the idea was that states could sue each other to solve interstate conflicts. Today, increasingly, individuals, citizens, can sue their own governments before international courts. A striking example of that is, of course, the European Court of Human Rights, situated in Strasbourg, France, where Danes, for instance, can sue the Danish government over alleged infringements of the European Convention of Human Rights. So individuals are being part of the picture, but there's a further development, and it's possibly the most controversial. That is that international courts increasingly, in some areas at least, play a role of semi-constitutional courts. That is that they oversee increasingly whether nation states, member states, are infringing or not international conventions and find them potentially in violation. So there is a sense of sovereignty shifting in the whole game. All this and this play that international courts play today is an evolution that's occurred over roughly 100 years. So let's try to step back a little bit and see where international courts came from and why they have come to play such a key or fundamental role in international society. The debate about international courts and the very idea of establishing international courts dates back long. We can find evidence of proposals for international institutions already in the 14th century, and arguably some of the church institutions have had supranational characteristics very early on in human history. But the first proper international court was a court established in Central America. It was a Central American Court of Justice operating out of Cartago in Costa Rica from 1907 until 1918. That was the first attempt at an international court. It was a short-lived one, but the experience of that court was brought over into the proposals for what eventually became the Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague. This court was established right in the aftermath of the First World War, and it was established to some extent as a reaction to the nightmare of the First World War and as an attempt to build a new world order in which this court should play a role alongside the League of Nations, the new international organization established at the time. If we look into the establishment of this court, if we look into the negotiations of what became the court, we realize that the fact that there was no experience with international courts beside the short-lived Central American court made the negotiators really be fumbling in the dark. No one knew exactly when such a court should be open, who should be the judges. They didn't even know exactly what procedures should be used before such an institution, for the simple fact that it has not been tried before. The Permanent Court then came into operation in 1922, and it's fair to say that it had some severe birth difficulties. So the establishment of this court is in a way a first sort of view into the lab of creating international society. And a very striking element of that was the question of who should be the judges. Because you can ask yourself the very simple question, who could, or really who should, be the chief justices over sovereign states? At the time, it was proposed that diplomats should take the role as a way of appeasing a little bit the sovereign states. All proposals included that you should have international law professors because they had the best training in the principal elements of international law. And finally, some suggested that you should have national judges being promoted up to the international bench. The result was a little bit a compromise of the three. You got a bit of law professors, a bit of diplomats, and a bit of judges inhabiting the first bench. And surprisingly, this worked fairly well during the 1920s jazz age of international law. In the 1930s, however, things started going in the wrong direction. It had less to do really with the court, but rather the fact that the world was increasingly tumbling down, and the conflict that started out in Europe and eventually spread to most of the world took essentially the life out of the first international court. The truth was that the court was revealed to be powerless in the face of realpolitik, of real power politics and warfare. The court stepped down, but in the aftermath of Second World War, history repeated itself. So when you established the United Nations, and even a little bit prior to that, you also chose to establish an International Court of Justice. What is today the International Court of Justice in The Hague? It is a continuation of the Permanent Court of Justice in many ways, and it sits in the same seat. Another innovation at that time were the military tribunals that were set up in Nuremberg and Tokyo. These were, in a way, carefully held outside the ambit of the new United Nations, and they were run by the victorious Allies. Those courts were early experiments in international criminal law that had some consequences subsequently in the 1990s when we started establishing war tribunals once again. But they were not permanent courts, and they disappeared from the map. What did not disappear was, however, the experiments that would occur in respectively Luxembourg and Strasbourg, where respectively the Court of Justice of the European Union, at the time the European Court of Justice, and in Strasbourg the European Court of Human Rights were established. Interesting enough, if The Hague had been the vanguard for the development of international law in the interwar period, the avant-garde in the post-Second World War period became these two little sleepy places on the European map, Luxembourg and Strasbourg. It was here that possibly the biggest innovation in law in the 20th century was distilled. It was the idea of supranational law. That was that you could construct such a system of international law that was an ever closer web of law enforced not just by international courts, but increasingly also by domestic courts. So in other words, rather than having sort of international courts sitting on top of the world, the way that particular European community law and later EU law came to work was via domestic institutions, applying that law and then referencing questions to the International Court in Luxembourg. This model of international law showed to work. It had an effect in the sense that apparently there was no more war in the member states. It enlarged gradually to include other countries such as Denmark, Ireland, the United Kingdom, at least for a while. And it was a model that was later to serve a little bit as a template in other regions of the world. If you fast forward in time, nothing happened in the 1960s, but we go into the 1970s, we see there's a few more dots on the map. In Latin America, in San Jose in Costa Rica, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was opened, and this court was to some extent using the European Court of Human Rights and Commission as a template for how to do such a thing. In Europe, we also had the Benelux Court of Justice being opened at that time. It was a little less consequential to the story I'm telling here. If we move forward a little bit further into the 1980s, we see a few more courts on the map. The most interesting is perhaps the Andean Tribunal of Justice, which was, like the European Court of Justice, a regional economic court. And interesting enough, once again, it modeled itself largely on the European templates. So as said, the evolution of international courts were to actually use a European trajectory more than the Hague-based trajectory. This becomes even more evident if we move further forward in time. In Latin America, we get, in a way, the revival of the Central American Court of Justice. What I mentioned was the first ever international court. It is resurrected with the same jurisdiction as the original court, plus a regional economic jurisdiction. In other words, it combines the first international court with a modern-day economic integration court as the Court of Justice of the EU. There are many other dots on this map. I'll just emphasize a few. For instance, in Africa, we see the ICTR, and that's the International War Crimes Tribunal for Rwanda. Similarly, in Europe, we have the ICTY. It's very famous here. It's the Yugoslav Tribunal following the war in Yugoslavia. We also have some other significant developments. The World Trade Organization chooses to set up its appellate body, which is essentially the court for global trade. And finally, at the more UN level, we have the ITLOS, which is the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So conflicts over law of the seas moved into this very specialized tribunal situated in Hamburg. If we go further, we'll see even more courts on the map. We can mention in the Caribbean Court of Justice. It's an interesting institution. It was in the making for roughly 100 years, and it is in some ways still in the making. It also, like the Central American Court of Justice, represents both history and novelty in the sense that on one hand side, it is this common constitutional court for the region, thereby replacing the old constitutional courts and at the same time also a regional economic court. In Africa, there's a whole set of courts opening at this time. And in Europe, I think the most significant development is the opening of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, a court that is immediately baptized the World Court, which happens to be also the name you gave the Permanent Court of Justice in 1922. So history is almost coming to a full circle, and the map of international courts is firmly established. These courts are all international courts, but they're of course not the same. And if we look at their level of activity, we'll realize that some are actually far more active than others. If we multiply the size of the little icons on this map with the level of activity, the map looks something like this. The pounding heart, beating heart of international justice in that perspective is in Europe. There's, in other words, it is in Luxembourg at the European Court of Justice and in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights that we see the highest level of activity. That raises the question, is it really predominantly a European phenomenon? Is it just some scattered institution over the rest of the world, or is it predominantly just something happening in Europe? Here you have an outline of the number of applications sent to Strasbourg, and as we see in this period, there's an ever increase. The current number of pending applications in Strasbourg is roughly 50,000, which is down from 160,000 some 8 years ago. But if we compare that to the overall evolution in terms of court rulings, and the data here is borrowed from a colleague, Karen Alter, and it looks at all the international courts except the two European ones, the Court of Justice of the EU and the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. And what you see is roughly the same evolution. In other words, that the takeoff of this judicialized international governance is predominantly happening since the end of the Cold War. And in terms of rulings, that is definitely the case. So what does this mean that we have these many courts with increasingly more rulings? Well, if we take it to a more societal level, it is striking that these courts operate in predominantly three areas of law and social life. That is in terms of freedom, in terms of international human rights law. It is a question about the economy in terms of international trade law, and it's in terms of punishment, in terms of international criminal law. These are the fundamentals of the establishment of the nation state, of course. You might add taxation and the military to have the full story of nation state. But if we look at these three areas, it is striking that core components of statehood are increasingly internationalized and under the umbrella of specialized international courts. This is not inconsequential, but rather it points towards a new development in the overall evolution of human societies and the organization at an increasingly global level. Thank you very much.